Hey, thanks for coming. Today's topic is about Samadhi and Self-Realization. And so, in order to explain those two things, I wanted to give you some information about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. In yoga circles, it's a famous book, and the commentaries on it. So I thought I'd make a comment on it. So this is my commentary, an oral commentary. We'll see how long it goes. One of a series. And what I'm going to do is comment. I have a Kindle book, $3. And you can go take a look at it. But what I did is I took the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by my own guru, Swami Satchidananda. And I commented on that, and I was looking at the book earlier today, and he talks about mental aspects, and so I did that as well. But I thought, okay, I should make a better commentary. Okay, well, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is about both Samadhi and self-realization. And one of the things that becomes clear after you've read the book and you've thought about it is that Patanjali makes a very clear distinction between self-realization and Samadhi. For instance, in the Yoga Sutras, Samadhi happens after the second chapter, the beginning of the third. The beginning of the third, which is on the cities, and so you could look at the 8 limbs of yoga or just preparatory, so you could use the state of Samadhi to acquire cities. And that's also true of one thing. Now, cities are an accomplishment. That's the closest translation to this. So where do you use the word accomplishment? Well, you could say that a musician is an accomplished player of the piano, for instance. That's what accomplishment means. You know how to do it. So immediately when you think about that, there's a lot of people out there teaching yoga and meditation that don't talk about the cities. And the answer is they can't do them. There's another answer also too, though, and you can see this in Autobiography of a Yogi, where people have an accomplishment that's out of the norm for people in this life. Things happen to them. My own guru, in talking he said a couple of things about the cities, and actually he said, oh, let's go get one, a minor one. But then he said later on, okay, so you have to look at things in context. When people asked him about superpowers, so this is other people, other contexts, he said, oh, before you learn to run, you should learn to walk. And by that he meant that you should know how to be honest and trustworthy and other things before you learn to get the cities. Okay, so let's get back. Yogananda in Autobiography Yogi talked about a strong man who used to fight tigers. And eventually, because he had that ability, he fought a tiger that almost killed him. And so then he stopped fighting. So this was a type of city where the result was not what he wanted. After you have the state of Samadhi, Patanjali says at the end of the 3rd chapter, which is where all the accomplishments are mentioned, he says that the cities become a distraction towards going to self-realization. By that, you can have a city that gives you wealth, but then the wealth becomes a problem in other ways. So you don't have to worry about the food you buy and stuff like that. Other issues come and dominate your life. And that's what the thing about the cities was in Patanjali's mind. Okay, you should learn to get a city so you can go beyond them. And self-realization is a state of mind. The mind actually has to become full of peaceful and happy thoughts. It says in the Bible, blessed are those that have purity of heart, for they shall see God. Doesn't mean they'll see it right away, but they'll see it in some time in the future. You're prepared for it. So Patanjali, in his commentary, starts out with the very first sutra. He says, now begins the discussion on yoga. So he talks about what yoga is, and yoga actually is a type of yoking, where your mind essentially becomes with the state of God. So if I'm a realized being, then it must mean that God wanted me to make this video. So here you have an awareness of what has to happen in order to have both the state of Samadhi and the state of realization. The first chapter deals with why do you want to have those things? And the answer is, if you're unhappy, this is the way to get rid of the state of unhappiness and be what you always have been, a person that celebrates your existence. You notice I said celebrate because both good and bad things happen to everybody. But it's how you receive them that determines whether they affect you negatively or positively. So some of the things that you talk about in yoga is how to reframe the mind, to have a different way of looking at things, so you always see the positive in it. Okay. One of the name of the fourth chapter is the state of Kevala, which means independence or absoluteness, where even very negative, bad things cannot even affect your mind. Let me give you an example that I heard about from people that were around Swami Satchidananda. One Sunday, he had a group of ladies over and he was talking to them about yoga, and they were having a tea, so everybody was having a great time. All of a sudden, one of the Swamis who looked at him came up and said, "You have a telephone call." So he went into the hall and took the phone call, listened to what the person said, hung up the phone, and went back to the meeting that he was having. And he continued to have a very good time, and so did the ladies. After everybody had gone, the Swami that had got him to come answer the phone asked him what the phone call was, and he says, "Oh, that was the realtor saying that our bid for this ashram, they're planning to buy a big piece of property in Connecticut, had fallen through." And the lady was completely surprised because they had been working on this deal for months and they thought that they had it. And for him to get this call, this is very negative news. And she was completely surprised because, and this is how we know the story, because she mentioned it to others, that Swami Satchidananda had not changed at all before or after. The people that were there at that meeting had no idea that this had happened. So that this, even though this is very negative news, it didn't affect his state of mind. So that's a clear sign of the state of realization. And subsequent events turned out that they actually ended up buying the land in Virginia. So a reframe would have said, well, this was meant to happen, but I can guarantee you that nobody in the ashram had a clue that this was going to turn out this way. So that's just some of the implications of yoking your mind to God, and to have the state of Samadhi and the state of realization be present. It means that you have cut yourself off from ever being sorry. Negative things don't affect you, nor in a way do positive things. So that's the first sentence in the Yoga Sutras. Now begins a discourse on yoga, and things flow from that. Okay. The second verse is, the restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff is yoga. Okay. Well, what is the mind stuff? Well, that's your mind. there's an ongoing chatter that goes on while you're in every situation. You're thinking about this, you're thinking about that. You may not even be thinking about what's in front of you, but your mind is always active. So restraint, okay, well, what does restraint mean? It means to hold back. Well, naturally, in your mind, you can have both positive and negative thoughts. So if you only permit positive, good thoughts to come in your mind, that's restraint. So somebody asked Swami Satchidananda, the lady asked Swami Satchidananda, why he was so calm when this news came to him on the phone while he was in the middle of that meeting. He said to her, oh, this was separate from the meeting, and he went back and had a good time. So he was present in the moment. He wasn't even thinking about that whole situation. And so this was amazing to the Swami. This is why she told the story. Okay, so you learn to, in order to have yoga or union with God, you learn to restrain your mind. That's part of the process. And it's like anything else you can learn. So this is something you can do. Okay? You can learn to restrain your mind. You're in charge of your thoughts. All you need to do is learn how to be in charge of your thoughts. So this is an activity that's possible to reach self-realization and the state of Samadhi. So after you learn to restrain your mind, then the statement is, then the seer abides then the self abides in his own nature. So you have God within you, and you can manifest God by restraining your mind. That's a simple statement. At other times, the self appears to assume the forms of the mental modifications. So it's saying, okay, there is a state that exists where you, the real you, is present all the time. Now, you can leave that state, and then your mind will assume the forms of the mental modifications. So what that means is that you can forget your true nature, and the mind will take on images and will fill those images with energy. So there's a lot of far-reaching thoughts here. And you'll see many times people will talk about, they'll ask the question, if you make a pot, okay, so you have a ceramic pot in front of you, is the space inside the pot different from the space outside the pot? And the answer, when you think about it, is no. So, if the being that you are is always God, can the canister or the container, this body, hold God? And the answer is no. God is both within and without. So, And even though God is manipulating this mind that appears to be an individual, it's still God. So when you're listening to this and you're hearing this, there is that God inside you that is listening to this. Okay, the fifth statement is, there are 5 kinds of mental modifications, which are either painful or painless. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, well, suppose you're a father and you have an autistic child. Are you going to be happy when your child displays signs of autism, not paying attention to other people, being very centered inside himself, and not being able to communicate and grow in the way that other kids do? Absolutely, this is very painful. What is a painless thought? A painless thought is you have a nice meal, a lunch, and the food is well digested, you have a good conversation along with this. The chief characteristic about this lunch is it doesn't bother you. It doesn't. After you leave the lunch, you go away, the lunch is no longer in your mind. So this is painless in that sense. And one of the things he talks about in the book, Swami Satchidananda talks about in the book, people say I've made my mind blank. Well, what he's saying is that's not really true either. Because you had a thought, oh, my mind is blank. So if your mind was really blank, you wouldn't have even had the thought, my mind is blank. Okay, so it's very difficult to get away and be in a mindless state. That's actually one of the characteristics of Samadhi, is the mind that is no longer active. Okay, there's 5 mental modifications, okay? Can either be painless or painful. They are right knowledge, misconception, verbal delusion, sleep, and memory. 7, the sources of right knowledge are direct perception, inference, and scriptural testimony. So it's saying that there's actually a system or a group of systems that are available to tell you what's correct. And one of the things that it says about right knowledge is it's scriptural testimony. So these are people that have been studying the nature of truth for a long time, and then they wrote down what they experienced. For instance, there's a book by Gandhi called My Experiments with Truth. That was essentially an autobiography of how he saw things. So that's right, that's a form of right knowledge. Direct perception. There's something inside you that knows what's true for you. And so when you see something and it conforms to what you know to be true, that perception is called direct perception. inference. You may not see something directly, but you can infer what the truth is. So if I make a statement that all men are sinners, does that include preachers? Yeah. Well, is that a true statement? Well, I can tell you that if you're a Christian and you say that all men are sinners, the inference is at some point you have to go out and sin in order to prove that you have a right thought. Wow. So in order to, and is that true in the Bible sense? No. If you go look at all the statements that Jesus made in the four, Matthew, Luke, John, and Mark, Jesus never said that all men are sinners. That was a mistake from the Old Testament that Paul continued. So is the inference right? Well, people like Jimmy Swaggart do their best to make sure it comes true, and Tammy Faye and Jim Baker fell right into that whole thing, didn't they? So this it can be tricky to fill your mind with the right thoughts. Okay. Misconception occurs when knowledge of something is not based upon its true form. You'll read in Vasishtha's Yoga, which is the story of enlightenment of Brahma, one of the avatars. That there's a statement that about how actions of the son of a barren woman. Well, is that a misconception? Well, you can say that the barren woman never had a son, so how can you talk to him or enter into activities with him? That's a type of misconception. An image, right? This is number 9. An image that arises on hearing mere words without any reality as its basis is a verbal delusion. Well, you could say that the barren woman's son is definitely a verbal delusion. What about mirages? This appears to be water in a lake out in the desert where there is no water. Is that a verbal delusion? Or is that a misconception? It could be both again, depending on usage. We could actually have a verbal delusion and say that the politicians in Washington are rational. We just had the debt ceiling, right? Debate. Okay, well here's an interesting one, number 10. That mental modification supported by cognition of nothingness is sleep. Well, when you wake up and you ask whether somebody had a good sleep or not, and they say, oh yes, I didn't even dream. I just had a wonderful sleep. Well, who was it that was aware when you were asleep? That's who you really are. Okay. When a mental modification of an object previously experienced and not forgotten comes back to consciousness, that is memory. So that's somehow you're playing back the images that you stored up somewhere else. That's memory. So those are the mental modifications. So Patanjali goes back and says, these mental modifications are restrained by practice and non-attachment. Okay, so if you don't like something and you have it in your mind, then what you have to do is substitute something else. Okay? That's what restrained by practice and non-attachment. Non-attachment means that you have no interest in it. So your interest in some object or some subject is zero. So if you meet somebody and you're in the business of selling somebody a car, as soon as you find out that person's not interested in buying a car, you're no longer attached to talking to them, and so you walk away. Non-attachment means you have relinquished any interest in that person or subject. So it's possible to change your mind and do that. Okay, so okay. Restraint by practice is one thing, non-attachment is another. Number 13 of these two, effort towards steadiness of mind is practice. So practice to make your mind steady so that it doesn't change as the reality around you changes. Practice becomes firmly grounded when well is headed for a long time without break and in all earnestness. So this is not something you can accomplish today. And typically it takes a long time for people to come to this state. There's a book by Buck called Cosmic Consciousness, and he studied people in the West that had a state of cosmic consciousness, and he determined not only they had this cosmic consciousness, but the age at which they received it. And most of that realization happened after the age of 40. Okay, so this tells you how long you have to practice. And Satchidananda goes in and tells the story of the guy that wanted to know how long it would take to become realized. Okay, so here's another definition of it. The consciousness of self-mastery in one who is free from cravings for objects seen or heard about is non-attachment. So whatever you hear, whatever you talk about to other people, if you have an interest beyond the present, beyond the now, this indicates that that you have an attachment to something. So you're going to have an attachment most of the time. So I go back to the statement by Swami Satchidananda. After that meeting, it indicated he was not attached to that. So all the effort that he put in to secure this property still didn't change his awareness, did it? So that now you notice that we're now up to number 15, okay, and in the first chapter, to number 50, okay, so we're a third of the way through, and we haven't really gotten to into the book on sadhana, the 8 limbs. Actually, the second chapter is the 8 limbs. We're talking about attachment, we're talking about the mind, we're talking about what we need to do. Okay. So eventually, so here's the very first statement, now line 17, 1/3 of the way through. Some prajna samadhi distinguish contemplation, okay, is accompanied by reasoning, reflecting, rejoicing, and pure I amness. So that the state of samadhi has to do with the absence of the mind itself. You need to strip away perception of the mind in order to experience samadhi. Very first statement about samadhi is the 17th line, and everything else is talking about the mental modifications. I think I'm going to stop here now and continue later. Thank you.